what I'm going to call something like higher dimensional syntax. And it's motivated by what's going on here this year, the special program, which is about studying the connection between homotopy theory, higher category theory, and logic programming languages, things like this, okay? So the sort of key idea motivating most of what's going on this year is that type theory is what I would consider to be, in contrast with set theory, a syntactic and computational formal system. And we've sort of found out now that a consequence of this formal system being more rigid by focusing more closely on syntax and computation is that the objects it describes are much weaker than your sort of typical formal system like set theory. What it ends up describing is what a higher category theorist would call infinity groupoids, or what a homotopy theorist would call homotopy types. Okay, so in a sense, it solves these problems. And so if you know much about higher category theory, the main sort of difficulty you have when talking about higher categories is something called coherence. We have morphisms. In a two category, you can ask that the one morphisms only compose up to isomorphism, but then those should have isomorphisms connecting isomorphisms, et cetera, and things get out of hand. The interesting thing about what type theory does is it solves coherence issues by just disallowing them from consideration. You just sort of don't admit any statements which aren't compatible with coherence, and then suddenly the problem goes away. So my question is, or the problem that most interests me for this year is what can you do for higher categories? Okay, so what falls out of type theory, everything is invertible. This is why we get homotopy theory, so I'm interested in what can be done for higher categories as well. And to do that, the idea is to focus on a model of higher category theory which is in a sense built out of syntax, okay, which is, right, there are many approaches to defining what higher categories are. Most of them involve choosing sort of certain shapes. And the shapes I'm going to choose are motivated by thinking of them syntactically. They're going to be trees. They're going to be higher dimensional trees. I'm going to sort of define for you what that means. Okay, so these shapes have been invented by various authors before and written about. They're most often called the opetopes. And models of higher categories based on them I will call opetopic models. Okay? So you can roughly think of them as the continuation of the following idea. You start with characters or formulas or atoms or whatever you want to call them of your logical language, and think of them as zero-dimensional things. And the next step is, if you want to describe a language, is to think about strings on those formal atoms. But then actually formal languages aren't really built from strings. I mean, they're really trees, right? If you're writing in a language, what you're writing down is a presentation of a tree, and we use punctuation and keywords and things like this to parse it. Anyone who's written a compiler or something like that knows that the first step to doing anything with your programming language is to turn it into a tree. So these shapes are what can be thought of as the continuation of the sequence: zero-dimensional, one-dimensional, two-dimensional, and then I'm going to show you how to go to n dimensions. Okay. So let's fix an alphabet, and I'm going to sort of, and what we'll think of as just atoms, and I'm just going to describe for you how you can denote trees of arbitrarily high dimension. Okay, and these are going to be pasting diagrams in a certain special form. Okay, so we start with just a single character A right here, and I'm going to draw the geometry on the bottom, and I'm going to draw my sort of syntactic presentation on the top. The first thing that it looks like is A just lands in this little box with a line that goes like that. Okay. And now we can add a bunch of more points to our diagram, and the way we do that is we stick little cards under this A right here. So I'm going to add a couple more points like this. Everything here is in dimension 0. It represents a point, and I've got a geometric configuration of points. Okay? Now, if I want to pass to the next dimension, what I'm going to do is you should look at this picture and think of this top as like a stack of cards, okay? A stack of labeled cards. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stare down through the page, and the top, the thing that is connected to the line lands on the top. And if I do that, what I see is a tree. So let me draw that tree. It looks like this. And just to help you, the edges of this tree correspond to the labels on the cards. Okay, does this make sense? So the new nodes of my tree, which I'm leaving open like this for a particular reason, correspond to the space in between the stack of cards. Okay? Oops, I want to go this way. Okay? So if I label those things, suddenly I've filled in the spaces in between these things with one-dimensional information. Okay? And now what I can do is just repeat. I'm going to think of any of these boxes that's connected to this line here as connected to a line. And by the way, this is my string. It's a little bit more general than the analogy I gave you before because we're keeping lower dimensional information as we pass to the next. So the string in this analogy is FGH, not the lower dimensional stuff, okay? So I'm going to stack more cards underneath. So if I put an I right here, remember this one corresponded to B, and this was I, so this says there's a one-dimensional piece of information below F right there. If I stick a J, but I can do things that are more complicated like this. If I stick a J in between G and H, that looks like this, because D was the lowest thing down here, and B is that one right there, right? And then I could stick a K over all of them. And now I've suddenly made a configuration of characters in dimension, well, it lives in dimension 1, but it's composed of one-dimensional pieces. Now I'd repeat. So I stare vertically through the page. Notice everything that was on the line and not covered by it becomes this tree right here. And the labels in between, like, look, does that make sense? So if I stare vertically through this page, I now see this tree. And if I label them with letters, I think of suddenly those two cells as inhabiting those pieces right there. So now, before I had a one-dimensional configuration, now I've glued two-dimensional space in between those pieces right there, okay? Well, so now this is it. That's the only rule, okay? So I consider any arrangement of symbols generated by this sort of form to be, in a sense, a higher dimensional word. So let me just do one more. So if I put a card down here and call it O, that means I have a 2-cell. And if you look at the things that it intersects, it's supposed to be F, G, and H, but suddenly I can't draw it anymore. It has to land over here, and I just repeated. So you have to imagine this thing is sort of folded together with a little pocket like that, and there's space in between. And if you draw the tree that comes next, it looks like this. And if I label it, I've glued in a 3-dimensional cell between these pieces right here. Okay? Does this make sense? So this expression right here is what I want to think of as a higher dimensional word. It's a collection of my atoms configured in space in a certain tree-like structure. Okay? So let me just. So this process it's that sort of simple. I'm doing something kind of childish. If I stop now, if I just continue this process, there's a couple places I can stop, and let me just point out, give them special names. If the diagram is sort of complicated, it has a bunch of stacks of cards, I'm going to call that a web. If it has no cards, I'm going to call that a pasting diagram. So if it's just the tree with nothing underneath. If it has exactly one, I'll call that a frame. And if it has just so a frame in particular is just a special case of what I was calling a web of things. The web comes from the fact that when I did this with one dimension, it looked like sort of just a web of things like that. Okay, and if it has it's a pasting diagram with just one box right there, I'll call it a cell. Notice it's necessary that a cell sits inside of a frame. That's the only way I could get something that looks like that. Okay. Okay, so now, like I said, this idea is these shapes have been presented in different ways by many authors. So if I just forget the labeling and consider all possible expressions that I could make like this that end with a cell, that's what people refer to as the opetopes. Okay, they form a category. You can denote morphism in this category by just starring a particular box, whichever one you like. The typical approach to defining higher categories is to say, consider pre-sheafs on this category with its face structure and give lifting properties and things like that. Okay, but I want to sort of take a different approach, which is motivated by what we're doing here this year. Okay, so the question is, if we take these expressions to be thought of as our syntactical units, what should the logical system of deductions be that we're thinking about? And well, it's kind of clear we're trying to think about category theory, and the only sort of inference rule I want to have is composition. Okay, and so composition works like this: if you have a pasting diagram, if you've constructed a pasting diagram, you get a composite of that pasting diagram, and so here's how it works: is I will just color the cell differently. Okay, so composite cells will be colored red. This is my sort of analog of having a lambda in my expression, right? Of having something denote a cell that has a different syntactic or a semantic function. And what ends up happening, it's not easy to figure it's not hard to figure out, is you just delete everything that was in between on the cell below. And then the question is, what should you label that by? And the answer is, you should label that new cell by the pasting diagram you just drew. Okay, this is why these sort of syntactic units are inseparable. I mean, if you have just a sequence of arrows in a category and you're trying to compose it, you want to write, well, this thing should be called G composed with F, right? But if you go to higher and higher dimensions, the name that you want to give to this composite gets harder and harder and harder. Well, the name you should give it is this expression. That's sort of the point, right? Okay.
What did you compose with what?
So remember, each little box is a cell. So whenever you have a pasting diagram, what you're staring at is a configuration of cells glued together. So what I've done is I've composed this diagram of three-dimensional cells into a single cell, which sits inside this frame, okay? And to denote that composition, the only sort of choice you have is to use the pasting diagram itself. That's why you should sort of think of these things syntactically. Okay, so what is this good for? What can you do with this? Well, the idea is in type theory is a language in which the inhabitants of a type are syntactic expressions for that type. They're derivations that there is something there. So let's take a category and see if we can do something similar. So let's take the free category on a graph. So here's a stupid graph. And what I want to do is I want to think of this graph as a set of axioms, logical axioms. And here they are. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add one extra box at the bottom, which I'm going to think of as the type. Okay, so my type here is G. First axiom says G has a zero-dimensional cell called A. Second axiom says G has a zero-dimensional cell called B. And this one says, just if you decode the picture into the geometry, it says there's a one cell connecting A and B, and a one cell connecting B and A. So the question is, in my logical system where composition is the only inference rule, what are the theorems based on these axioms? And let me just give you an example. So an example sort of well-formed expression would be this pasting diagram right here. And so when I compose that pasting diagram, I get this composite cell which goes from A to A. So what I'm saying is the fact that I've constructed the free category on a graph is just a consequence of the inference rules in this language of expressions, okay? I don't need to sort of define the category as consisting of objects and consisting of morphisms and things like that. It just consists of axioms which have consequences. Okay, so the inhabitants of this free category are just all possible consequences. In fact, there are many, many more. This is why it's higher category theory that I'm sort of aiming at, because there are many things that are provably isomorphic to A, and there are identities and iterated identities and things like this, which are all just consequences of composition. And some more things about composition which I haven't told you. Okay, so before I do another example, let me just show you something else. In this theory, unlike in sort of traditional type theory, as it's the higher dimensional information is gotten by introducing a new type, which people refer to as the identity type. And you'll probably hear a lot if you're around here this semester. So what's the analog of that? Well, okay, so I said that in my expressions, I'm going to write the type on the left-hand side over here. And the introduction rule says this. If I have a frame, which remember I said is just a pasting diagram with exactly one box below, then there's a new type. It's the type of objects which fill that frame. So how can I denote that? Well, I just put a box around it, and I keep going. Okay, so the rest of these expressions, K here actually technically denotes a 2-cell, but I've shifted it. It's a 2-cell filling in this pasting diagram here, but I've shifted it down so that it's a 0-cell of a new type. Okay? And so for example, here is the denotation in this language of the identity type. And here is the denotation of the identity type on the identity type between A and B and F and G. But the difference is in this language that there's no distinction. The expressions have an intrinsic dimension already to them. Okay, the second observation is that you can encode all of our families of inductive types this way. So for example, if I want to encode binary trees, here are the axioms. I can encode them all in sort of dimension 2. I don't need anything more than dimension 2. What I'm going to do is define this data type of binary trees to be this shifted version, which describes for you the fillings of this cell right here. You can tell because the prefix is the same. So what things live in this type that I've just defined according to my things? Well, one thing is the root. This was an axiom. But the other things are compositions of cells. And because of the cells that I've given you, because of the shape of them, the only compositions I can make, except for the identities, and I don't want to sort of get into that here, are binary trees. So, and you can tell right here, the actual syntactic description of the binary tree I've created from this inductive type is a picture of that binary tree itself. That's why I pictured it. That's why I picked this example, right? So in a sense, all I'm asking you to do, if you're a type theorist or whatever, is work with the abstract syntax tree instead of working with the one-dimensional expression for something. And as a consequence, you can sort of go to higher dimensions. So that's the idea. But you can even do dependent types as well. So for example, if you want to do vectors, it looks like this. But I need a special kind of extra box, which I would have to sort of tell you about later. But you see sort of everything appear very nicely. The index will always appear in dimension 1, and parameters will sort of appear in dimension 2. And the green box here is meant to mean that any natural number, anything that I can produce that's a natural number, I can stick on and just tack on, and it will be an endomorphism of X. In any case. OK, so open questions. So this is a sort of interior theory of higher dimensional types, which can have non-invertible cells, or I think of it as that. What is the corresponding theory of functions? Is there one? How do you define them? What properties need they have? Is a theory of functions between types like this even possible? All the types I described, the answer is yes, because I've replaced, in a sense, inductive by free. A second thing is, what would co-free objects look like, or co-inductive definitions? Because those should be crucially important to a theory of higher categories. And a second is semantic theorems. I mean, I would say that I have a proof or it's hard to call it a proof, that I can denote the free omega category on an Opetopic set as a set of expressions in this language. The problem is, how do you state the universal property of free? So this is an almost theorem, which still needs some work. So yeah, that's the kind of things I'm working on. So thank you very much.